Alright, body cavities are actually very, very important in our bodies, and we'll be looking at the structures that are contained within these body cavities, but we need to understand their role in our human anatomy and our physiology. So what exactly is a body cavity? Basically, it's a chamber or room within our bodies that our vital organs are able to attach to. So, what do they do and why do we need them? Why can't we just throw the organs in and have them attached just anywhere? Well, our organs are actually kind of delicate, and so we need them in order to protect from accidental shock. Even as you're sitting there, if we didn't have body cavities, our organs would actually slide down to the bottom, kind of in our belly, and just be sitting there. When we moved, they would slide with us. That could actually really impact their ability to function. They also cushion our organs as we move. As we walk, as we sit, as we lie down, as we turn, it's important that we have that cushioning for those organs. It also allows them to change their size and their shape without causing harm. So things like our lungs can inflate and deflate so they can get bigger or smaller, or our heart can beat, and neither the lungs are going to get damaged by getting bigger or smaller, and the surrounding tissues around them are also not going to get damaged. So it's a multi-directional prevention of harm here. All right, we have two places that our cavities are found. We have ones on the dorsal side of the body, or in other words along the back, and also on the ventral side. The ventral side contains the largest cavities within the body. Now, if we take a look at the dorsal side and the dorsal cavities, we have two parts. We have the cranial cavity, and with that name, I can bet you would be able to guess that this is what houses our brain. And the second one is the vertebral canal, or our spinal cavity. Based on that name, I bet you would guess that it contains the spinal cord, and of course they both do. And that's it for the dorsal side. We don't have any other cavities on that side of the body. Like I said before, the larger and more complex ones are on the ventral side. Now, the ventral cavity sometimes is referred to as the coelom. This is actually a classification term that we use because there are certain vertebrates that have a coelom and certain ones that don't. Within this ventral cavity, we have our organs that we refer to as our viscera in general. So if you think about it, you go deer hunting, and one of the things that you need to do after you've killed the deer, before you actually start kind of cutting it up, is you eviscerate it. So in other words, you remove all those vital organs. The ventral cavity is actually divided into two portions by the diaphragm. So that is kind of the dividing line. The diaphragm is not a membrane, it is actually a muscle. The superior part of the ventral cavity above the diaphragm is called the thoracic cavity, and the inferior one is referred to as the abdominopelvic cavity. All right, let's take a closer look then at that thoracic cavity. Within the thoracic cavity, we have three internal chambers. We have the pericardial cavity, which contains the heart, and pleural cavities. We actually have two of them. So we have the two pleural, and then the one pericardial gives us three cavities inside of the thoracic cavity. In the pericardial cavity, we have the heart, which is cushioned by the membrane that we mentioned before. That's called the pericardium. The layer of the pericardium touching the heart is referred to as the visceral pericardium. And then in between the layers of the pericardium is the space, which is the pericardial cavity. And then we have the layer that is next to the body wall that is referred to as the parietal pericardium. And this is actually kind of a good setup in terms of what this pericardium actually looks like. Okay, so you've got the membrane that lies closest to the heart, and then a space with that fluid in it, and then the outside portion, which is the parietal pericardium. It's almost as if you took your fist and put it inside of a partially inflated balloon. The part of the balloon that's actually touching your fist would be the visceral pericardium, whereas the outer layer away that you're not touching but is still part of the balloon would be that parietal part. We will actually take a closer look at the pericardium when we look at the heart, and specifically in our dissection of the heart we will see those. Notice that the pericardium actually doesn't go all the way around. We have this opening at the top here. It doesn't kind of form a complete circle, and that's to allow the blood vessels that go in and out of the heart to be able to do so. The pericardial cavity lies within an area that's described as the mediastinum, and I've got the verbal description for you. In a separate recording, I'm actually going to take you through a couple of diagrams, and the diagram does a really nice job of pointing out exactly where the mediastinum is. Alright, so the other cavities that are present in the thoracic cavity are the pleural cavities, and we have two of them, one on either side of the pericardial cavity, and as you can probably guess, each of them surrounds a lung. Now the lining of this, the membrane that lines it, are referred to as the pleura. So the visceral pleura is the part of the membrane that covers the outer surface of the lung, and the parietal pleura actually covers the lung side of the mediastinum as well as the inner body wall that lie away from the lung itself. So that's all that's in the thoracic cavity. So let's move on to the abdominopelvic cavity. In the name abdominopelvic, you can probably pick out what the two major divisions are. You have the abdominal cavity, which is the superior portion, and the pelvic cavity, which is the inferior portion. Inside of the abdominopelvic cavity, we also have the peritoneal cavity, and this chamber is actually bound by a membrane, whereas the other two are not, and the membrane is called the peritoneum. The parietal peritoneum is what lines the inner surface of the body wall. As we would go deeper, then we would see that we have a small amount of fluid and then another membrane that's kind of almost shrink wrapped on top of our organs, and that is called the visceral peritoneum. You can actually see on this diagram, and it's nice that it's in color. I'm not focusing here on the thoracic cavity, I'm focusing down here on the abdominopelvic. You can see the relationship between these three cavities within the abdominopelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity is here in the light blue, and the pelvic cavity is down here in the darker blue. You can see that neither one of them have a membrane dividing them. But what kind of overlaps the two, uses all of the abdominal, and part of the pelvic is the peritoneal, and that is what is actually bound by the membrane. So the abdominal cavity itself extends from the diaphragm to the superior margins of the pelvis. So if you feel like the top of your hip bones, that's basically where the abdominal part of the abdominal pelvic cavity ends. It contains the liver, the stomach, the spleen, the small intestine, and most of your large intestine. The pelvic cavity is inferior to the abdominal, and it's below that upper portion of your hip bones. You've got the distal portion of your large intestine. You also have your urinary bladder and your reproductive organs. That distal part of the large intestine is within the peritoneal cavity, but the urinary, including your kidneys and the bladder, as well as the reproductive organs, are outside of the peritoneal cavity. Now, in the next video, we will actually work with the two diagrams that outline the cavities, so I'm going to show you how to color those, and we'll also go through the concept map that kind of links everything together with the cavities.